This morning we're going to, of course, would help if I had the mic on, wouldn't it? There we go. This morning we're going to begin by taking a look at Deuteronomy 21. As we've been walking through these laws in the book of Deuteronomy, remember I've kind of wanted us to keep our minds focused on two things. One is the overall intention of the laws, and that is to form and shape Israel into a people who are holy. And what that means, I think, is it means that Israel is to be a people whose life kind of reflects the priorities of God. And the second thing that I think we've seen is that as we look at each law, we want to ask ourselves the question, well, what is this law aiming at? What is it telling us about holiness? What is its purpose? So we'll continue to do that today. So in Deuteronomy 21, we begin with a provision for how Israel is to deal with unsolved murders. So you've got a murder that hasn't been solved, isn't going to get solved. What do you do in that case? And here we have a provision for dealing with it in Deuteronomy 21, starting at verse 1. If in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess, someone is found slain, lying in the open country, and it is not known who killed him, then your elders and your judges shall come out, and they shall measure the distance to the surrounding cities. And the elders of the city that is nearest to the slain man shall take a heifer that has never been worked, and that is not pulled in a yoke. And the elders of that city shall bring the heifer down to the valley with running water, which is neither plowed nor sown, and shall break the heifer's neck there in the valley. Then the priests, the sons of Levi, shall come forward, for the Lord your God has chosen them to minister to him and to bless in his name, that by their word every dispute and every assault shall be settled. And all the elders of the city nearest to the slain man shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck has been broken in the valley, and they shall all testify, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it shed. Accept atonement, O Lord, for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, and do not set the guilt of innocent blood in the midst of your people Israel, so that their blood guilt be atoned for. So you shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from your midst, when you do what is right in the sight of the Lord. Now, this is a really interesting provision, and I think it says something really significant. We don't want to miss it, right? So, right in our minds, right, you've got a murder, the culprit can't be found. It becomes what we now call like a cold case, right? And it goes in a file in some police station somewhere, probably never to be dredged up ever again. But this is different in this sense. Murder, in effect, inflicts impurity on everyone around it. It's not just an act against an individual, but rather the murder of someone, in effect, causes a sort of a stain or a blight on everyone around the murdered person. And so the procedure here, there are two things that have to happen. I think this is kind of interesting, right? So the elders come out and they find where the body was found, and they measure and find the town that was nearest to the dead body. And the elders, the representatives of that town, have to come out. They have to bring a heifer that's never plowed a field, and they have to break the heifer's neck and sacrifice the heifer, and then they wash their hands over it. Now, so what we basically have going on here is two things, and they're both important to notice. Thing number one, the elders of the town are in effect testifying that they and the people that live in their town are innocent of this crime, hence the washing of the hands, right? It's a sort of testimony to innocence, if you will. And then the second thing is that the sacrifice of the heifer is a sacrifice of atonement, which atones or removes the impurity that's caused by the murder. Now, there's a really important principle that's going on here that, once again, we just want to notice here. Notice here that in the Old Testament scheme of things, murder is not simply a crime that someone commits against another person. And if you can't find who did it, well, that's kind of like too bad. You know, it goes in a file cabinet somewhere. No. All murder finally is committed against God, who's the author of life. And therefore, if you have an unsolved murder, you have to have a sacrifice of atonement, which in effect removes the impurity from the people that comes from the murder. Now, I think this is a really important principle, right? It's reminding us of something that's really significant. It's reminding us of the fact, once again, that we've seen over and over, that for the Old Testament, and clearly for the New as well, human life is not simply anyone's own, but rather all life belongs to God. And therefore, when it's taken, especially when it's taken unjustly, that means that in effect, God is sort of the victim, not just simply the person who was killed. So you have to have a sacrifice of atonement that's offered. Now, I think the question that you can ask here, right, would be, well, what is this saying? And I think one thing that it's certainly saying, right, is, once again, what we're seeing here is a reflection of the value that's placed on human life here in the context of the law. Human life is valuable, not just because of the status of the person who was killed, they were imported or unimported or something like that, but rather human life is important because God is the author of all life, and therefore all human life is important and significant. So that's a really important principle. Now, beginning in Deuteronomy 21, starting at verse 10, we have another law. This has to do with folks taken captive in war. So let's take a quick look at that. Once again, we'll think about, well, what is it saying? When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. Now, once again, this needs to be set in its proper context, right? So remember, in the ancient world, you conquer someone, you conquer town, village, people, you round them all up, and they become your captives. Some you kill, some you sell into slavery, some you take as slaves for yourself. This law is actually sort of placing limits, and we've seen others, on what you can do with captive peoples. So notice what's going on here. I think this is really interesting. So let's say you're part of a conquering army, you've conquered this town, you see a woman captive, you desire to marry her. There are a number of limitations that are going to be placed on you. Limitation number one, you have to allow her time to, in effect, grieve over being separated from her people, her village, right? So you've come to this village, you've taken the village captive, you're taking this woman away. You actually have to allow her time to grieve her separation from her people. You can't just like take her right away and make her your wife. So I think that's a really interesting provision. The second thing that's provision that also kind of provides a limitation is if you decide that you don't want to be married to her anymore, you have to let her go and to go where she wants. You may not, and this would have been like counterintuitive in this world, you may not sell her as a slave. You've married her, she's your wife, and therefore you may not treat her as property. You can let her go, but you can't sell her. So I think this is a really interesting set of provisions. And once again, I think we want to ask, well, what does it say? And one thing that it's clearly saying, right, is we're seeing once again the value that the Old Testament places on human life, even the lives of sort of people who are sort of taken captive in battle, who in the surrounding culture, right, have no rights or privileges whatsoever. Here they're given them. One of the things we'll see as we walk through the Old Testament is that Deuteronomy consistently sort of adds protections to people who normally don't have it. Slaves, women, people taken captive in battle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Old Testament's very interested in protecting what can be done to the most vulnerable people around, of whom this is one of them. Now, we also have in Deuteronomy 21, verse 15 and following, we also have another provision that relates to marriage. Deuteronomy actually has quite a bit to say about marriage, and we'll see that as we walk toward the end of the book. Just bear in mind here that probably for a good deal of Israel's history, a lot of folks, a lot of men in Israel practiced what we would call bigamy. That is, they had two wives. Bigamy being a form of polygamy. Polygamy on a smaller scale. Okay? Eventually what will happen is that Israel will become a monogamous society. This next law deals with what happens in a bigamous relationship. If a man has two wives, so that's what bigamy is, right? Having two wives. If a man has two wives, the one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne children. If the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has. For he is the firstfruits of his strength. The right of firstborn is his. So once again, another very unusual principle, right? So you have two wives, right? And this suggests right away one of the inherent problems of bigamy and also polygamy, right? Inevitably, among multiple wives, there's going to be like a favorite one and a not so favorite one, right? The provision here is, let's say you've got two wives, and let's say the one who's less favored has your first son. You can't say, well, because I don't like her all that much, I'm going to wait till like the loved wife has the first son, and that'll be my firstborn, entitled to inherit a double share of my estate. Deuteronomy here prohibits that from happening. Okay? Firstborn son is firstborn son, regardless of which one of your wives happens to produce him. Okay? So once again, we see a limitation placed on what a husband could do. Just sort of a footnote here in terms of what Deuteronomy is attempting to do with marriage, and it takes a while to see this because there are all kinds of provisions regarding marriage things that we might find somewhat strange, but the direction that all this is going in is this. Deuteronomy really is hearkening back to the second chapter of the book of Genesis, where, remember, the man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. So Deuteronomy is very interested in preserving marriage as an institution, preserving its integrity, and in effect protecting it from two threats. On one hand, right, there are external threats to marriage, and those come from the culture around it. But there's also a second threat, right? The second threat from marriage comes from within it by some of those who are practitioners of it. Okay, so, and Deuteronomy is actually interested in correcting both those kinds of abuses of marriage. And once again, to kind of get the full picture here is, Deuteronomy really has a theology of marriage that it takes a little while to kind of get at, but as you read it through, you sort of get the larger picture here, and that's something like this. Marriage has sort of a twofold importance. On one hand, marriage is a fundamental institution which is basic to the whole social order, in that if marriage is not functioning properly, society won't be functioning either. Because guess what? All the members of society come from a husband and wife. So if that relationship is disordered, then in effect, right, that's going to lead to disorder in the larger society. So that's one aspect. Another aspect of marriage, and this is really important too, we won't get this explicitly until we arrive at the New Testament, but another thing that's going on here is that marriage, the relationship of husband and wife, is a way of beginning to think about God's relationship to the people of Israel. So one thing that will emerge here later on, you see this particularly in Isaiah 61, God's relationship with the people of Israel will be likened to the relationship between husband and wife. And of course, by the time that we get to the letter to the Ephesians, right, Paul's going to remind us, right, that husbands should love their wives how? As Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So we're going to see that sort of flowering out. So all this is sort of designed in that interest, in allowing marriage to sort of function as a sign of God's relationship to his people. Now in Deuteronomy 21:18, we have what you're supposed to do with a rebellious son. So let's take a look at that. Obviously, this is not going to make it into any modern parent manual for obvious reasons. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives, and they shall say to the elders of his city, "This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He's a glutton and a drunkard." Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. No doubt, right? Once again, what's that? Yeah, we want to notice, I think, two things here that are important to notice. One is directly related to Deuteronomy. Another thing is the thing that Deuteronomy is kind of pointing to. So once again, it's really important to recognize that in this society, in the Old Testament, the Old Testament really has no concept of what we today call rights. Okay, that's going to come much later on. Instead, the Old Testament has a sort of a different way of understanding human society and the relationship of people to one another. It fundamentally understands human society as covenantal, right? People don't have rights. They have obligations and responsibilities, okay? So what holds society together is I have a responsibility to you, you have a responsibility to me, and things break down when those aren't honored. Here we have a case where a son's responsibility to his parents has completely broken down. And I think that it's really made clear, right? It's not just the son has on occasion said, I don't want to do that. Or it's not like, there was one evening where dad said, okay, son, you need to go upstairs and do your homework. And son said, no, I don't want to do my homework. This is a case where the son has consistently rejected parental direction. And so in the mind of the Old Testament, right, what's going on here is the son has, in effect, broken his covenant obligation with his parents, while the parents have not broken their covenant obligation with him. They haven't stopped being his parents, right? He stopped being their son. That's what's happened. And so there's this punishment. The other thing we want to notice here is this phrase, glutton and a drunkard, should be relatively familiar to us, right? Because this is exactly the way that Jesus is described in the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Luke by those who dislike him. So notice what they're saying. When the Pharisees describe Jesus as a glutton and a drunkard, they're not just saying, okay, he's got a drinking problem and eats too much. They're labeling him as a rebellious son deserving death. Okay? The odd thing, of course, is that Jesus actually is not a rebellious son at all. He's actually the faithful son, capital F, capital S. Okay, so there's a really important resonance there that we don't want to let go. Finally, to sort of continue on this happy note, we now want to talk about people who get hung on a tree, and then we'll kind of move on. So this is in Deuteronomy 21, 22 to 23. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death and is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him in the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So, important instruction here. You've got someone who has committed a capital crime. This person's body is hung on a tree, in effect, sort of like in display of this person is cursed. And this becomes now clear to everyone. Once again, important New Testament residents here. Paul, in Galatians 3, uses this verse to talk about Jesus' death on the cross. And you can kind of see how this would be relevant to it, right? Paul says, right, quoting this passage from Deuteronomy 21, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And that's how Jesus died, right? He hung on a tree. And this helps Paul sort of understand or interpret something that's going on the cross. So Paul's saying, look, here's one way to kind of think about the cross. If we want to think about sin as kind of like drawing God's curse upon us, Paul's saying that one of the things that happens on the cross, right, is that Christ, in effect, draws onto himself everything that actually should have come to us. And we're delivered from it. Okay? That is, in effect, right, Christ is the just person who's hung on the cross, who, even though he is just, draws upon himself everything that sin was going to cause to come to us, and therefore delivers us from it. And this is part of his larger picture, right, of Christ's both love for us and his self-sacrifice to our to our benefit. So once again, he's sort of presupposing that we know this passage from Deuteronomy and that we actually know what it means. Now, let's take a look at Deuteronomy 22. We're getting a number of things here. And once again, as you read through, sometimes this seems like sort of like random laws, and you can get lost in it, and it can seem sort of unexciting. But once again, right, what we want to do is we want to read this carefully, and then we want to ask ourselves, okay, now, what is this getting at? What's the principle here? So let's take a look at that. And actually, a really important principle is being introduced here in Deuteronomy 22 that we'll want to note. So let's take a look, first of all, at Deuteronomy 22, 1 through 4. You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray and ignore them. You shall take them back to your brother. And if he does not live near you, and you do not know where he is, you shall bring it home to your house, and it shall stay with you until your brother seeks it. Then you shall restore it to him. And you shall do the same with his donkey, or with his garment, or with any other lost thing of your brother's, which he loses, and you find. You may not ignore it. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and ignore them. You shall help him lift them up again. So let's just kind of think about this principle here, because I think it's really significant. Remember, I said a few moments ago that Israel is a covenant society, and a society that's bound together by mutual obligations. Here we're seeing a good example of that. Let's say I happen to look out my window, and I happen to note, right, that some of my neighbor's sheep are like somehow have gotten out of the pasture, and now they're like wandering down the road or something like that. I can't say, well, this is Fred's fault. If he'd have fixed that fence like I told him to, those sheep wouldn't be wandering around. It's his problem. No, it's not. It's my problem too. Why? Because I have a covenant obligation to Fred. Why? Because he's my neighbor. Why? Because God says that I do. Okay. Now, you may remember, right, way back in Genesis, remember after Cain kills his brother, and God comes to talk to Cain and says, oh, by the way, I haven't seen your brother around anywhere. Where is he? And Cain says, how should I know? Am I responsible for my brother? The implicit response he gets from God essentially is, yes, you are. So here, right, I've got a responsibility to Fred, and I've also got a responsibility for what belongs to Fred. There's another principle here that we also want to take a look at. People also have responsibilities to animals, to not treat them cruelly. And the reason for that should be obvious, right? Because they're God's creatures too. Some of them have been given to us for food, but that doesn't mean that we're free to abuse them or neglect them or ignore them. Because once again, right, they're God's creatures, so I have an obligation to them as well. And so I have to do one of two things. I either have to kind of run out and somehow get the sheep back to Fred, or if Fred lives far away, I have to get the sheep to my place and wait till Fred comes and says, hey, I'm missing 7 sheep. Have you seen them anywhere? And notice, right, I'm not free to say, no, I haven't. Who knows where they could be? I have to admit to Fred that, yes, I've seen your sheep. They're in the barn somewhere. They're out in my field. I've got them here. You can have them back. Also notice this. If I find that some of Fred's, Fred's animals are stumbled and fallen in some drainage ditch or something like that, I've got to help pull it out. Once again, right, it's not just Fred's responsibility, it's mine too. So notice once again, the principle that's at work here. People have kind of responsibilities and obligations to one another. And it's those obligations and responsibilities that bind the society together, right? When that sense of mutual bonding, when that sense of mutual responsibility starts to break down, then society itself starts to break down as well. And then in 22:5, we get something really different, or seemingly different. A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. Now, some Old Testament scholars think this actually may be a reference to some things that may have gone on in pagan worship where women sort of dressed up as men or men dressed up as women. We don't really need to settle that issue. I think one of the issues that's coming out here once again too is, this goes back to thinking about the order of creation. So in Deuteronomy and also in the Old Testament, New Testament as well, the idea here is that there's kind of like a basic order to creation. And part of that order, right, is that there's a distinction between the two genders, the male gender and the female gender. And that distinction is actually something that God intends, and that the distinction is actually for our good and for our benefit. And like other parts of creation, right, things tend to go wrong when we decide that we don't need to acknowledge that distinction or that particular order. And so we have a warning against that here, that there really is a difference between men and women, and that the attempt to sort of erase or blur that difference is not actually going to help anybody. It's actually probably going to make things worse. So we need to acknowledge that distinction. And once again, right, this goes back to, once again, the Old Testament sort of vision of marriage, right? Remember, back in Genesis, the man and the woman were made for one another. They were intended to sort of like go together. And therefore, the attempt to sort of erase distinctions or blur things is going to interrupt that purpose. So once again, the purpose on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, or that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. So interesting provision here. You're foraging around, you happen to come upon a bird's nest. There's a mother bird on the nest, just like there was a couple weeks ago, and one of those flower things out there by the door. You can take the eggs and eat them, but you can't take the eggs and the mother. You can only take one. You can't take the mother with it. And the idea behind this, right, is you're in effect wiping out two generations at once. You're killing the mother, and you're also killing the eggs. And there, once again, sort of a break is applied to human freedom, and it's now limited in this way. You're to honor and to respect the nature of what's going on here. 22:8. This actually was. This sounds almost like an episode from some show on HGTV. When you build a new house around the edge of a roof, some of them have like granite parapets, and some have bronze parapets, and someone flies in a designer from somewhere, and they design like an $80,000 parapet to go around the edge of the roof, and that sets off a whole fashion trend. Just remember this, right? Here in this society, remember, roofs are flat, and you do a lot of living on your roof because you're off the ground, you're kind of closer to the breeze, especially in the evening. And in some cases, right, people would build even like structures on the top of the house, and they would like eat up there, sometimes even sleep up there. So you've got this flat roof, people are up there. You can't say, it's going to cost $15,000 to build a bear. That's way too much money. Let's just forget that part. No, you have to do it right, because once again, you have an obligation to people to protect them. And so you're going to put that little parapet around your roof, and you You may end up as, you may end up as a show on HDTV. You may not, but you still have to put it up there, okay? Because once again, this is an obligation. And then 22, 9 through 12. Once again, this will sound, kind of odd. We just want to remember the purpose here. You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest the whole yield be forfeited. The crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear cloth of wool and linen mixed together. You shall make for yourselves tassels on the four corners of the garment with which you cover yourself. So once again, this seems to be like odd, to us. Why all this, right? And I think the thing to say here is this, right? These are in effect kind of ways for Israel to sort of like preserve purity in sort of like everyday activities. So you got your vineyard, right? You sow one kind of grape in this vineyard, not multiple kinds. You've got one kind of cloth in a garment. You don't yoke a donkey and ox together because remember from our reading of Leviticus, right? Donkeys are unclean. You don't yoke a clean animal to an unclean animal. But once again, we want to just notice the larger purpose here. The larger purpose here behind this provision of Deuteronomy is in effect to sort of visibly set the people of Israel apart from all the people around them. Because they're doing things that no one else is doing. And so they're literally like marked out as different, okay? So we just want to kind of remember that's what's going on here. Now, the next section here in Deuteronomy 22, starting at 13, once again takes us back to Deuteronomy's concern for sexual morality. So we want to kind of just note this before going on. And I think what we can do is say this by way of generality. The question here is, thank you, Charles. Charles is telling me that it's time to stop. Just one thing before looking forward to next Sunday. We want to kind of think about here why Deuteronomy is interested in sexual purity and why there's so much about it here. And once again, it's this. For Deuteronomy, and really for the Old Testament as a whole, sexuality is a gift from God. It's part of who we are. But here's the thing. It's a gift that's very easy to misuse. And therefore, what Deuteronomy is constantly doing is, in effect, providing guardrails to help the gift be used properly. So we just want to keep that in mind. And we'll stop there, Charles. Thank you.